The mansion's iron gate slowly opened, revealing a garden so immaculate that every leaf seemed hand-placed. The sound of the delivery cart's wheels on the stone sidewalk echoed in the morning silence, broken only by the distant chirping of birds. Behind the cart, a man walked with firm but discreet steps. He wore a simple cap, a faded shirt, and worn fabric pants, like any employee hired to make deliveries. His gaze, however, was unusual. He observed every detail, from the white columns at the entrance to the position of the security cameras, as if he already knew the place intimately. None of the employees working in the cleaning or gardening suspected who he really was. To everyone, he was just another unfamiliar face carrying boxes, probably someone filling in for a regular delivery driver. But in reality, he was the man who had signed the purchase contract for that property years ago, the owner of every stone, every window, and every inch of grass in that garden. He, the millionaire who used to arrive in luxury cars and tailored suits, now disguised himself to enter his own home as a stranger. The reason? To test. He wanted to see how the mansion's new maid treated someone who, in her eyes, had nothing to offer. He'd read reports on her efficiency, heard praise from other employees, but he was suspicious. Money had taught him not to blindly trust polite smiles. He'd often found interest hidden behind kind gestures, and he wanted to know, who was she really when no one was looking? As he crossed the courtyard, he heard footsteps coming from the inner hallway. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the half-open kitchen door. And then she appeared. She wore a clean but simple uniform, her hair tied in a makeshift bun, leaving a few strands escaping at the sides of her face. She carried a bucket of water and a rag, as if she were on her way to clean another room. When she saw him, she frowned slightly, as if recognizing a stranger who didn't belong. "There. Good morning," he said, his voice neutral. "Good morning," she replied, without interrupting her steps, but still watching him sideways. There was a reserve in her gaze. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't the kind of automatic friendliness one offers to important visitors. He realized that to her, he was just another worker, and that was exactly what he wanted. He walked to the entrance hall, pretending to look for the best way to leave the boxes. The marble gleamed in the light, streaming in through the tall windows. The paintings on the walls, which he himself had chosen at an auction in Paris, were now just a backdrop for his disguise. The maid passed through the hallway again, this time carrying a tray of cups. He noticed she avoided making conversation, keeping her demeanor focused on the task at hand. This detachment intrigued him. Was it coldness or professionalism? As he placed the boxes on a side table, he took the opportunity to discreetly glance around the living room. The decor was exactly as he'd left it during his last official visit, but there were small touches he hadn't remembered seeing before: fresh flowers in the central vase, curtains slightly open to let in natural light, and a stack of books on the end table. Could this be her work? Small details that revealed care, attention, or perhaps simply following orders. He decided to prolong the meeting. Instead of leaving immediately after the delivery, he pretended he needed to confirm the delivery. He walked to the kitchen, where the aroma of coffee mingled with the smell of freshly baked bread. The maid was there, chatting with another employee about the day's to-do list. He waited for his colleague to leave before approaching. "I think I need someone to sign here," he said, handing over a piece of paper he had taken out of his pocket before entering. She looked at the paper and then at him, hesitating for a moment. "That's not my business, but I can call the house manager." "He," replied, already picking up the phone without asking any questions. This stance reinforced the idea that she was following protocol, without getting too involved. But it still wasn't enough for him to draw conclusions. He needed to observe her more, provoke situations that would reveal who she really was. He took the paper back, thanked her, and pretended to leave. However, before reaching the door, he discreetly bent down and dropped a small wallet with a few visible bills. Then he walked a few steps away and waited, alert to what would happen next. The maid noticed almost immediately. She glanced at his wallet, then at the door he'd passed through. The pause lasted longer than he expected, and every second increased the tension of the test he'd created. If you enjoy stories full of suspense, twists, and unexpected emotions, give the channel a like and subscribe. Here, each chapter is designed to keep you hooked until the very last second, and the next one might be even more. Surprising. She took a deep breath, grabbed her wallet, and hurried down the hallway. When she caught up with him in the garden, she handed it to him firmly. "I think this fell out of your pocket." Thank you very much," he replied, keeping his tone neutral. "It's the right thing to do," she said, turning quickly to get back to work. He watched her walk away, intrigued. Perhaps there was more honesty than he'd imagined, but this was only the beginning. There was still much to discover, and he was willing to go to the end of this disguise to find out for sure. The kitchen door was ajar, and he could see the new maid moving with almost choreographed precision, like someone who knew every corner of a home, even though she'd only been there a short time. It wasn't yet clear whether this was a sign of genuine efficiency or just the automatic reflex of someone accustomed to performing tasks without regard for others. He entered silently, taking in every detail: her impeccable apron, her simply tied-up hair, her steady hands washing a pile of dishes as if the outside world didn't exist. When she noticed him, she glanced up for just a moment. It was brief, but enough for him to try to decipher whether there was a trace of sympathy or silent judgment. Her gaze didn't linger, and soon she returned to her task, as if he were just another shadow crossing the room. For someone who didn't know who he really was, this might have been natural. But for him, accustomed to curious or fawning glances, it was unusual. "Good morning," he said, testing his tone, letting his voice drop to a neutral level without the authority it normally carried. He wanted to see the reaction. "Good morning," she replied, with the same neutrality. There was no smile, but there was no coldness either. It was as if the words were delivered with just the right amount of weight, without waste. He realized it wasn't rudeness, but a certain calculated distance, like someone who'd learned not to get too close too quickly. Maybe it was part of her personality, or maybe it was the way she treated any new employee. He approached the counter, pretending to be interested in a fruit tray, while in reality observing her behavior. There was no civility, but there was no disregard either. It was as if she had already catalogued who he was, or who she thought he was, and decided it wasn't worth the effort to impress him. This, to him, was intriguing. He was accustomed to people who were quick to please, especially when they believed they might gain something in return. The silence between them was broken only by the sound of running water and the scraping of porcelain plates against each other. He expected a gesture, a comment, any attempt to start a conversation, but nothing came. This made him wonder. Either she was extremely focused on work, or she simply saw no reason to interact with someone who, in her eyes, was unimportant. The difference between the two possibilities was crucial to what he wanted to discover. As he picked up an apple, he noticed something almost imperceptible. As her knife slid to cut a vegetable, her eyes narrowed for a second, as if she were assessing something in him. It wasn't fear, nor dislike, but perhaps a silent reading, a mental register. It was the kind of look that said, "I saw you, and I already know which mental drawer to put you in." He wondered which drawer exactly she had put him in. That first, brief encounter already revealed much, more than any long conversation could have. Her posture, her economy of words, her lack of gestures to impress, all formed a framework that, for him, held value. People reveal more about themselves in what they avoid doing than in what they strive to show. He knew this. And that woman, even without realizing it, was already telling him who she was. Now, what he needed to know was whether that neutrality was the veneer of a fair person who treated everyone equally, or whether it was a selective barrier, erected only against those she deemed irrelevant. The difference would define not only his opinion of her, but also the fate he was planning for their relationship, a fate that, at that moment, only he knew. He knew that trust isn't built solely with pretty words, but with small, precise gestures. So without announcing his intentions, he began creating discreet situations to test her true essence. They weren't explicit traps, but small experiments camouflaged in routine, where her every reaction spoke louder than any speech. In the first of these, he left a banknote, carefully positioned in an easy-to-see spot, as if it had been hastily forgotten. The position was strategic. It wasn't so exposed as to be obvious, but neither was it hidden enough to go unnoticed. He watched from afar, disguised as inattention, noting every micro-expression on her face, the moment her eyes found the note, the automatic reflex of her hands, and, most importantly, the silent decision about what to do with it. There were also the requests for help that arose seemingly spontaneously. One day he needed to carry a heavy box to the warehouse. The next, he'd ask her to urgently check a document. Simple tasks, but they revealed readiness, interest, and even the way she balanced her own demands with helping others. He mentally noted the time it took her to respond, the intonation of her words, the presence or absence of a genuine smile. It was all part of a mosaic he was piecing together, piece by piece. It wasn't just about being helpful. It was about how she approached the act of helping when there was no visible reward in sight. The tests proceeded so naturally that anyone could mistake them for ordinary, everyday moments. Sometimes he'd drop something on the floor on purpose, just to see if she'd bend down to pick it up. Other times he'd leave objects out of place, waiting to see if she'd put them back together on her own initiative. It was in these automatic gestures that, for him, the essence of a person was revealed. There was no script, no preparation, just the raw truth of involuntary actions. He knew that when no one was looking, the deepest habits were revealed. Therefore, he made a point of not creating any tension or pressure. He preferred that everything unfold at her own pace, as if it were just another irrelevant detail of the day. At times, he mixed subtlety with a touch of defiance, leaving clues that something wasn't right, to see if she would notice them on her own. A half-open drawer, a cabinet with the door barely closed, a valuable object left in an inappropriate place. He watched not only whether she noticed, but what she did afterward. Did she alert someone? Did she fix it herself? Would she pretend not to see? Each reaction registered in his memory as part of a psychological puzzle. After all, more than honesty or efficiency, he wanted to understand her attitude toward the unexpected, whether she was someone who acted with initiative or simply reacted when pressured. There were also more subtle, almost imperceptible situations in which he measured the consistency of her behavior. Once he asked her to organize a set of documents, but among them he included an irrelevant piece of paper, purposefully placed out of order. The intention wasn't just to see if she would notice the detail, but to observe how she would treat something seemingly unimportant. Would she overlook it? Would she carefully rearrange it? Would she question the presence of that paper? For him, the value lay precisely in paying close attention to things most would overlook. This was how he separated the truly committed from those who merely completed tasks mechanically. These small tests, though silent, were carefully calculated so as not to seem invasive. He wanted her to remain natural so that her responses would be pure and spontaneous. Over the days, he realized that what impressed him most were not her grandiose actions, but the quick, almost instinctive decisions she made without realizing they were being evaluated. At these times, her social mask fell away, and her character emerged unfiltered, making it clear who she was when she didn't have to prove anything to anyone. It was almost by chance in one of those moments when attention is focused elsewhere that he overheard fragments of a conversation not meant for his ears. The maid, who always seemed so firm and discreet, spoke in a lower voice than usual, almost as if the weight of the words made her fearful that the air would carry them too much. He didn't move closer on purpose, but the inevitable proximity allowed each syllable to permeate the space and find a home in his mind. She mentioned overdue bills, an upcoming rent payment, and something about a family member urgently needing medical treatment. There was a mixture of concern and resignation, as if she had already learned not to wait for help, just to keep fighting as long as possible. He couldn't shake his thoughts. Her image, always in impeccable uniform, erect posture, and a courteous smile, now took on a new dimension. That composure hid more than simple professionalism. It concealed silent battles fought out of plain sight. And that was precisely what intrigued him. How could someone maintain a routine, complete tasks and serve attentively, while carrying a burden that seemed unbearable for anyone alone. This realization sparked a curiosity within him that wasn't just that of someone wanting to know more, but of someone wanting to understand, to feel closer, to perhaps find a way to help. He began to observe with different eyes. He noticed that, although she was always ready to answer, there were times when her gaze would wander for a second, as if drawn by memories or worries. The pace of her steps sometimes slowed as she crossed the hall, and there was a slight sigh before she regained her composure. These were details he would never have noticed before, but now, with what he had heard, everything made sense. He remembered small absences that previously had no explanation, days when someone would cover for her, or occasions when she would arrive a few minutes late. None of these seemed serious at the time, but now, in context, they appeared as silent clues to a harsh reality. As he reflected on this, a kind of genuine empathy began to grow. It wasn't the superficial pity one feels and then quickly forgets, but a connection that stirred the instinct to protect. He knew he could simply ignore what he'd heard, as most would do to avoid getting involved. But something in him resisted this indifference. There was an uneasiness in his chest, a feeling that, for some reason he didn't yet fully understand, this concerned him too. As if somehow fate had placed this information in his path for him to do something with. At the same time, he realized he needed to be careful. He couldn't simply invade her privacy or demonstrate that he knew more than he should. He needed to find a balance between approaching her and respecting her boundaries, between offering help and not making her feel exposed or humiliated. This made him even more attentive to his gestures, words, and opportunities. He began looking for natural openings to initiate less formal conversations, to listen without pressuring her, to create an environment where she could feel safe if she wanted to share something. There was also a deeper side to this unease, a reflection on how so many people carry such stories invisible to the hurried eye. How many times had he himself come across someone who smiled but was broken inside? This realization touched him personally, as if it had opened a wound that had always been there, but had never been noticed. Perhaps it was this combination of discovery and identification that moved him so. Deep down, he knew that this maid wasn't just someone who works here. She was a lifetime of memories, responsibilities, and pain, who had accidentally crossed his path, and now he could no longer see her as before. Their conversations began tentatively, almost like someone treading unfamiliar ground, testing the weight of each word before releasing it. At first, they were brief exchanges, comments about the weather, the coffee growing cold too quickly, the street scene seen through the small window. But little by little, something began to unfold. She, accustomed to carefully measuring each sentence so as not to expose herself, began to feel that there, before him, there was room to be more than just the woman everyone saw, the woman with a simple life, a predictable routine, who carries in her eyes a story that no one seems to have time to hear. He listened with an unusual level of attention. It wasn't the kind of distracted listening where someone simply waits for their turn to speak. It was a silence filled with presence, which made every detail she shared take on weight and importance. And so, between a light laugh and a deep sigh, she began to reveal the dreams she'd harbored since childhood, dreams that to many would seem too impossible. She talked about how she imagined traveling to places she'd only seen in photographs, about her desire to study something that had always fascinated her, but that life hadn't given her the time or money to pursue. With each sentence, he seemed to understand not only the words, but also the empty spaces between them, those pauses laden with meaning that only those who have lived long enough to feel absence understand. She spoke of fears she had never expressed aloud, fear of growing old without having felt she had truly lived, fear of settling into a destiny others had written for her, fear of becoming invisible while the world turns for those who dare more. And as she spoke, she realized she was neither judged nor interrupted. This silent understanding encouraged her to go further, to open memories that would normally remain locked in the most protected part of her soul. She recounted how as a child she dreamed of being an artist, but learned early on to trade colored pencils for bills to pay. She confessed that she sometimes imagined her life as a poorly edited film, full of scenes cut before the climax. Instead of offering ready-made answers or lessons, he asked questions that led her to reflect further, as if he wanted her to find the thread that connected all those pieces of herself. In the moments when her gaze wandered off into space, trying to gather her thoughts, he remained there, holding the pause, allowing the silence to become part of the conversation. There was a silent complicity, as if they both understood that it wasn't about saying much, but about saying what really mattered. She began to realize she was revealing herself in a way she hadn't in years, perhaps ever. Their conversations stretched on, sometimes on a wooden bench in a quiet square, sometimes walking slowly through quiet streets at dusk. During these times, she shared small details that seemed insignificant to the world, but carried the flavor of her essence. The smell of bread that reminded her of her grandmother's house, the old music that made her heart race, the desire to one day plant a garden of her own. He absorbed every bit of this narrative like someone reading a rare book, its pages marked by unique stories. And without even realizing it, she began to look forward to these encounters. It was as if, with each conversation, he was picking up pieces of himself that he'd left behind. The strangest thing was that deep down, she believed she was talking to someone who understood her simple life, because there was a familiarity in his gaze that disarmed her. She never imagined, not for a moment, that perhaps he wasn't just a casual listener, but someone with his own reasons for wanting to know every layer of her. He knew that to be certain about who was at his side, he needed to create a moment so unexpected that it would elicit a genuine reaction from her, without time for disguises or rehearsed words. It wouldn't be a simple comment or a small provocation, but something that would stir her most immediate emotions. Then, with the calculated calm of someone guiding a chess piece, he began to narrate, as if it were something that had just happened, that he had lost an extremely important document, one that cannot be easily replaced. His words were chosen precisely to convey the gravity of the situation. He spoke of the possibility of losses, the bureaucratic complications, the feeling of helplessness it caused him. He observed every detail, the movement of her eyes, her posture, the way she breathed, looking for cracks in the facade, signs of empathy or distance. When he realized she was already involved in the story, he added a new layer. He also mentioned that he would urgently need money to solve the problem. He didn't mention any amounts, he didn't explain details, he simply let the weight of urgency hang in the air. It was at this point that a person's true nature revealed itself. The silence between one sentence and the next was intentional, allowing her mind to fill the space with thoughts and emotions. Was there solidarity? Indifference? A practical cold tone, or a gesture of immediate support? Every second was like a thorough character examination. He knew that in these critical moments, the social mask fell away, and what remained was what truly mattered: intention, loyalty, a willingness to help or walk away. As he spoke, he noticed her hands moving, sometimes clasping her fingers, sometimes clutching the fabric of her clothing, as if searching for an answer within herself, and he, inwardly, mentally noted each reaction, aware that this was not just a test, but a silent revelation that could change his perception of her forever. He was almost blending into the crowd, maintaining the impeccable disguise he'd maintained since the beginning of that night. Every gesture, every word, every calculated smile had been executed with surgical precision so that no one there would suspect who he really was. But then, like a cold wind cutting through a closed room, someone who hadn't been in his plans appeared, a long-time employee, or perhaps a close friend of the millionaire, with a look that carried the intimacy of someone who knows details that shouldn't be revealed. The man appeared in view as if out of nowhere, crossing the room with determined steps and a curious expression, and his mere presence made the disguised man's heart race, not out of fear but out of the knowledge that any slip-up, no matter how small, could unravel everything. The two passed each other for a few seconds, but long enough for the unexpected visitor to narrow his eyes, trying to confirm if the figure before him was truly who he appeared to be. There was no denying it. There was an implicit recognition, a spark of memory igniting behind the gaze. and it was at that moment that the tension set in, almost palpable. An internal silence enveloped the disguised man as he calculated in fractions of a second how to react. Time seemed to stretch, as if each blink were a studied movement. The employee or friend moved closer, and the feeling was that the world around him continued at its normal pace, but between them, a dangerous game was playing out silently. The visitor's hand rested briefly on the disguised man's shoulder, a seemingly cordial gesture, yet laden with insinuations. The words came in a casual, almost friendly tone, but with a slow cadence as if weighing each syllable to gauge reactions. "I know you from somewhere, don't I?" The question came with a slight smile, but the eyes weren't smiling. There was a mixture of curiosity and suspicion in them, a search for subtle confirmation. The disguised man maintained his composure, returning the smile with a slight tilt of his head, as if stalling for time. He knew the answer needed to be convincing, but not overly rehearsed. One false. Move and all would be lost. The air seemed thicker. Some nearby guests quickly turned to watch the brief exchange, not realizing that in that brief exchange lay the risk of ruining an entire plan. The tension wasn't in what was being said, but in what lingered in the air, in the strategic pauses, in the eye contact that lasted a second longer than necessary. While the visitor waited, like a patient predator, the disguised man searched his instincts for an exit. And it was at that moment that a waitress passed between them, interrupting the direct line of tension. A small respite, but not enough to dissipate the danger. The visitor took the opportunity to step aside, remaining close, still observing. It was clear he wasn't convinced, that perhaps he was about to ask a more direct question, the kind that would rip anyone's mask off. The disguised man knew that if that happened, there would be no room for retreat. His mind worked frantically, searching for a way to redirect the conversation or create a convincing distraction. A joke, a reference to something superficial, or perhaps a bold move that would completely divert the focus. And it was in this impasse that the surrounding atmosphere, laughter, music, toasts, became merely a backdrop to a silent battle of wills. The visitor smiled wider, but his eyes sharpened like blades, and in a low tone, barely audible to anyone within a few feet, he uttered a phrase that, alone, had the power to crumble the entire theater set. Up that night, she couldn't believe her eyes. The seconds seemed longer as she watched that luxury car, with its impeccable paintwork and dazzling shine, glide through the mansion's imposing gate. The smooth, almost silent engine contrasted with the roar that moment was making inside her. It wasn't just any car, much less just any visitor. She recognized the silhouette behind the wheel even before he turned off the engine. That employee, the man she'd always seen following orders, carrying boxes, arranging things, and walking discreetly through the hallways, now appeared before her eyes as someone who not only belonged there, but who, somehow, commanded it. The sight of a security guard opening the door for him, with the same posture reserved for bosses or authority figures, sent a shiver down her spine. The mansion's employees greeted him with reverence, a respectful nod, some even bowing their heads slightly, and this only deepened the feeling that the entire time she believed she knew him had been built on a lie. He didn't seem out of place in that setting. On the contrary, his posture, his walk, the ease with which he crossed the courtyard, everything screamed belonging. The visual impact of the scene was brutal. The grand facade, with its imposing columns and meticulously manicured gardens, now seemed to take on a new meaning. It was as if this space had always been his, and she, blind until then, had never noticed. The man she had thought simple, perhaps even limited in resources, emerged there like the centerpiece of a chessboard she had never known existed, and confusion mixed with anger, heat rising to her face as questions raced through her mind. Why hadn't he told her? What else were you hiding? Had he laughed at her for not realizing it? With each step he took, past images surfaced, seemingly innocent exchanges, silences that now sounded strategic, looks she interpreted as humble, but that perhaps were the cold calculation of someone who knew more than he let on. The memory of moments when she'd seen him submit to orders or small tasks now rewrote itself with a new narrative. It wasn't submission, it was an act. And if it was an act, what was the purpose? To test her, to manipulate her, to use her as a pawn in a larger game. What hurt most was not just the revelation that he wasn't who he said he was, but the fact that, on some level, she had trusted him. Trusted enough to believe she knew his essence, that she could predict his reactions, that he was transparent. Now all that trust seemed childish, naive. She felt as if she had lived inside a story carefully written by him, where every detail was placed to shape the image she would have of him. And it didn't help that, as she tried to absorb it all, he seemed utterly comfortable in this new skin he was revealing, or perhaps it had been his true self all along. He greeted people naturally, exchanged short, confident words, and looked at every corner of the mansion as if it were a part of him. The man she'd known in simple clothes was now wearing something impeccable, perfectly tailored, and made of fine fabric, which betrayed not only wealth, but also someone accustomed to having the best. The sound of laughter coming from the main entrance made her realize she wasn't dreaming. A group of people, also well-dressed, welcomed him with familiarity, as if meeting someone on equal terms, perhaps even of a higher rank. There was no doubt he wasn't just a special guest, he was the center of this gathering. Inside her, something broke and something new formed simultaneously. Betrayal and confusion walked hand in hand, mixed with a strange admiration for finally seeing the truth he had so carefully hidden. But this admiration didn't lessen the weight of the wound. It was like discovering that an actor you thought you knew off stage was also acting in real life, and the play was your life. Her heart beat fast, not from enchantment, but from the avalanche of possible interpretations crashing down on her. It was impossible not to feel exposed, as if every previous conversation were now a revealed trap, every gesture an ignored clue. And most disturbing, if he was capable of hiding something so great, what else was behind this facade that was only now being revealed? He took a deep breath before speaking, as if carefully choosing each word to sound both firm and revealing. His eyes never wavered from hers, but there was a weight in his expression that indicated this was no improvised speech. He began by explaining that from the beginning there had been something unsettling in him, a silent instinct that made him suspicious of the intentions behind her smiles and sweet words. It wasn't just insecurity, it was a constant feeling that he needed to be assured she was there for him, and not for what his last name, his heritage, or his family's status could provide. He said that, at first, he tried to ignore this feeling, telling himself it was unfair to judge without proof. But experience, the stories he had seen happen, and even some veiled advice from people close to him, led him to adopt a cautious stance. It was then that he decided to act. He created a disguise that went far beyond simple clothing or avoiding ostentation. He began to present himself more humbly, casting aside any trace that might reveal his comfortable life. He avoided talking about business, drove a common car, and frequented simple places, all to see how she would react when there was nothing extraordinary to offer, when he was just an ordinary man, without the pomp that so often deceptively opens doors and hearts. During this time, he observed carefully how she treated the waiters, how she reacted when their plans didn't involve luxury, the sparkle in her eyes when he spoke of dreams rather than material possessions. While maintaining this role, he discovered things that left him torn between relief and doubt. She didn't complain about the lack of luxury, but there were moments when her gaze seemed heavy, as if she were mentally calculating whether it would be temporary or permanent. For him, every detail mattered, and so he decided to go the extra mile. Without her knowledge, he began discreetly helping her with some of the problems she was facing. He anonymously paid off a debt she owed to a former business partner, prevented a lawsuit from reaching her by hiring a lawyer in secret, and even managed to get a project of hers, which was about to be rejected, the necessary approval. All without signing his name, always through intermediaries, to ensure she didn't directly link the help to him. Little by little, he realized how she reacted to these situations. She was happy, grateful, relieved, but she never knew who was behind it. This was the proof he needed. Whether she loved him for who he was or for what he had, She would remain by his side, even without knowing that all that help came from her hands. However, along with this strategy, a constant tension grew within him. Every time she smiled or showed affection, he wondered if that feeling would survive the moment the truth came out. The line between test and lie grew thinner every day. Now, before her, he decided he could no longer bear this alone. He revealed that all the time he'd shown himself to be more simple wasn't just chance or modesty, but an experiment in understanding the truth of their relationship. He recounted every help he'd given unnoticed, every situation he'd resolved in the shadows, every moment he could have used his own name to gain immediate gratitude, but chose to hide to see who she truly was. His voice didn't tremble, but there was an almost palpable weight in the air, as if each word cut through the space between them. He knew this moment would redefine everything. She remained motionless for a few seconds, as if the world had slowed down so that every detail of that moment could be recorded for eternity. The millionaire's gaze held neither arrogance nor the weight of someone offering something expecting something in return, but rather the serenity of someone who understands that certain encounters are guided by something greater. It was as if he already knew that this gesture would change not only her life but his as well. The silence between them became almost sacred, and deep in her soul she felt that this was not just a man before her, but an instrument used by God to fulfill a purpose. He then took a deep breath, looked into her eyes, and spoke words that would shatter any barrier, that he had seen something rare in her, something not found in store windows or bought with a fortune, the dignity of someone who holds her head high even when the whole world tries to push her down. He told her that her courage was inspiring, that her determination was a jewel honed by pain, and that this radiance was precisely what he wanted to see blossom even more. And so, he was willing to open a door that had until then remained locked to her. The proposal wasn't symbolic or disguised charity, but a concrete change of destiny. A job with conditions that would not only make her debts disappear, but also make her dreams a reality. Financial assistance that wouldn't come as a handout, but as an investment, allowing her to finally live the life she always wanted without feeling limited. And more than that, it paved the way for her to have freedom of choice, the freedom to write her own story with her own hands, but without carrying the weight of the world alone. She felt her body tremble. She thought of all the times she'd cried in secret, all the times she'd felt invisible, and now she realized that every tear, every difficult step, every sleepless night had led to this. There was nothing random about that scene. It was as if the heavens had bent down to touch the earth, allowing two such different paths to meet and complete each other. The millionaire didn't know it, but in that moment, she understood she was facing an answer she'd prayed for years, not in the form she'd imagined, but in the perfect time and way. When she finally accepted, it wasn't with the attitude of someone receiving a favor, but of someone recognizing that life sometimes decides to reward those who didn't give up. He extended his hand, and the grip was firm, sealing not just an agreement, but a silent pact of trust and gratitude. She felt a deep peace, as if a gentle voice told her that from then on, she would no longer be alone. And he, in turn, seemed lighter, as if he had found a meaning greater than any material achievement he had ever had. The wind blew stronger, lifting her hair and bringing a sense of new beginnings. The sun, previously obscured by clouds, broke through the grey sky and illuminated their faces, as if a sign of approval from above. Her life had changed, and they both knew it. It didn't matter if the future would bring new challenges, for that day would be marked as the point at which God decided to show that he was always in control, that he always listened, that he never abandoned her. If you believe that moments like these don't happen by chance, if you feel that God's hand can use anyone to transform a life, like this video and subscribe to the channel. In the next video, I'll reveal an even more surprising story where a simple gesture changed the course of an entire city, and you'll understand why nothing is coincidence when there's a greater purpose at work.